pray, and then we'll start digging into Nehemiah. Father, thank you for your word. Thank you for let's rejoice in your word. The way that you'll see the people in Nehemiah's day rejoicing that they heard and understood the word. What a gift to hear and understand. So grant us that gift today as we read the word. All right. So I don't. You probably covered this at least. Nehemiah and Ezra, probably the same book originally. The first time in history we see them separated is actually in Origen's time, so around the 3rd century. Prior to that, they're always in the same scroll, kind of the same thing. So there's been some controversy throughout history as to whether or not they're even authored by the same person. So we're going to look a little bit at authorship. So if someone wouldn't mind turning in their Bibles to 2 Chronicles 36:22, and then someone else, who's got that? Raise your hand if you're going to flip that. Dan's got it? Great. And then, so 2 Chronicles 36:22. I'm going to have you read that at the end of the chapter, but someone else, while Dan's looking that up, find Ezra 1, chapter 1 at the beginning of the chapter. I'm going to have you read 4 verses. Who wants to volunteer to read that? Nice. All right. All right. So Dan, once you've got that, just read verse 22 to the end of the chapter. You're reading chapter 1, verse 1, verse 4. Thank you. All right. Very good. So if you'll notice there, very similar passage. In our Bibles, when we have them ordered, you can easily see it because they might be on the same page, at least in mine they are. Can you see where it's different? Where the change happens? I'll just show you. So at the end, if you look at 2 Chronicles, at the end of there, it says, "Let him go up," and then it ends there. But in Ezra, it continues. It says, "Let him go up to Jerusalem." So this is verse 3, Ezra, "which is in Judah, and build the house of the Lord, the God of Israel. He is the God who is in Jerusalem, and let each survivor go on there." So, anyway, because of this, something suggested that perhaps they're all the same author, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Chronicles. I think there's another sort of internal piece of evidence. If you ever read through the Bible and read Kings versus Chronicles, Chronicles has more of this sort of priestly emphasis. There's all these chapters on roles of the priests, how David set up the system of priests, singers, and all these different things. So that would sort of fit with the content of, let's just say, Ezra is the author of all three. Anyway, obviously, though, there are some parts in Nehemiah which switches from third person, right? He, she, it, to first person. I did this, I did that. So those parts are obviously written by Nehemiah. It says, "I, Nehemiah," but I don't think Ezra wrote that. But anyway, I think there's at least a compelling case to be made. That maybe all three were written by Ezra the scribe. Anyway, all right. So we're going to look a little bit at some of the date and chronology questions. So it's been kind of a big source of controversy, dating this book, because we've got dates for a lot of these kings. So instead of sort of relying on the secular sort of dates that we have, there's been questions about whether or not Ezra and Nehemiah are taking place at the same time or about 100 years apart. Because you have different kings, right? You've got Ahasuerus, that's in, that's Ahasuerus. I'm trying to remember the name, which ones they were with. But anyway, you've got different kings. You've got Ahasuerus, Artaxerxes, Xerxes, and Darius. So you've got all these different names. And the question is, are these referring to the same king, right? Or different kings? So we'll look at that a little bit. But broadly speaking, it was written around 539 BC, somewhere between these dates, because that's the beginning of Cyrus's reign, all the way to 425 BC, which is when Artaxerxes' reign. So 539 to 425 BC. Interesting to kind of look at what was going on in history elsewhere. We kind of forget that like important events are happening at the same time in different places. So at that same time period, the Greeks defeated the Persians at the Battle of Marathon and Salamis during that time. Pericles is reigning in Athens during this. The Greek tragedians flourished, so Sophocles, Euripides, and I don't know the other one, but and Socrates is teaching at this time. We've got Cincinnatus, dictator in Rome. Buddha and Confucius both live and die during that time period. So anyway, we think of history as happening these disparate events, but a lot of times they're happening at the same time, so it's interesting to think about. So there are two ideas. There's long chronology, short chronology, as I mentioned. So the long chronology is probably favored by more scholars today. So in my Old Testament class at Bethlehem, my professor, Dr. Howard, David Howard, by the way, the nephew of Elizabeth Elliot, Elizabeth's maiden name is Howard. So, but anyway, he favors the longer chronology. Let's see. It's kind of, I would say there's something similar in this debate. We'll look at the internal evidence in the books themselves. If you just took that at face value and you didn't look at the names of these kings and when they reigned, you would get the impression this is all happening at the same time. It's kind of similar to trying to fit evolution into Genesis, right? You're bringing outside information, trying to make it work, but it makes the text not work as well internally. So, the question really is, should we defer to unbelieving scholarship in order to, bring things into the Bible? And it's a debate. Good brothers disagree on this. But I'm going to advocate the internal consistency view, and the short chronology. So the long seas, about 100 years span between Ezra and Nehemiah. So that's going to lead to some problems from the text that we're going to look at. So if someone would turn to, let's all turn to Nehemiah chapter 12. We're going to look at some of this. All right. Someone want to read verse 1? Who volunteers to read verse 1? Raise your hand. Jeremiah? All right, great. Who volunteers to read verse 26 in chapter 12? 3 hands went up all at once. Whitney, all right. And then who volunteers to read 31 through 36? Oh, Jeff went up first. Sorry, Fiona. Okay, great. So, Jeremiah, what was that? Oh, yeah, sorry. There's some weird names here. Don't worry about getting them wrong. Just verse 1. Okay, so Ezra, right? Ezra's there. Now, I don't know how common the name was, but He's a priest. We know that. And anyway, verse 26. There we have Ezra the priest and scribe, which is sort of the moniker we have ascribed to, I think, in Ezra. So interesting there. Good luck, Fiona. That's that's no easy set of names to read there. So if you could see there in verse 33, so you got Ezra named, and then at the end it reiterates that Ezra the scribe went before them. He's the one who led the charge, which makes sense, right? If you read it, the things that happen in Ezra, Ezra's the priest is leading all these things to get set back up. So again, this is Nehemiah, right? And it would seem to be potentially concurrent with the events of Nehemiah. All right, and if we want to, I'll read this one. If we go back to chapter 8 of Nehemiah, verse 9. And Nehemiah, who was the governor, and Ezra, the priest and scribe, and the Levites, who taught the people, said to all the people. So, we've got Nehemiah, the governor, right? And we've got Ezra, the priest and scribe. There we go. Another, that one puts them both in the same verse. So, anyway, we saw back in there, we've got Ezra, the priest and scribe, Ezra, the priest and scribe. These names are repeated over and over. So, if we want to turn back to Ezra, chapter 7, before Nehemiah. All right, so we're going to look at verse 6. I'll just read it so we can keep moving here. This Ezra went up from Babylonia. He was a scribe, skilled in the law of Moses, the Lord, the God of Israel, had given. And the king granted him all that he asked, for the hand of the Lord, his God, was on him. There we go, Ezra the scribe. Verse 11, same chapter. This is a copy of the letter that King Artaxerxes gave Ezra the priest, the scribe, a man learned in manners and the commandments of the Lord, and his statutes of Israel. Artaxerxes, king of kings, to Ezra the priest, the scribe of the law, of the God of heaven. So there we go. And then in verse 21, I, Artaxerxes the king, make a decree to all the treasurers in the province beyond the river, whenever Ezra the priest and the scribe of whenever Ezra the priest, the scribe of the law of the God of heaven, requires of you, let it be done with all diligence. Sounds like the same guy, right? That title's just repeated so often. One more to look at here. So we're going to turn back to Ezra chapter 2. I know we're spending a lot of time in Ezra for Nehemiah, but I think these questions are important to sort out. So go to Ezra chapter 2. And I will have someone read this. It's a few names, so bear that in mind. Just could someone read verses 1 and 2 of Ezra chapter 2? All right. It's right. Yeah, that's hard. That's hard. Um, is there another name you guys might have noticed there? Does another name jump out at you? Mordecai. So now we've got Mordecai too. And by the way, Mordecai's name means man of Marduk or servant of Marduk. It's a weird name for the Hebrew to have, which I think makes it even more likely that this is the same Mordecai from the story of Esther. Of course, this doesn't, again, work out if you take the kind of broader, more common view today, but internally it makes more sense. And then obviously Nehemiah is there too, as we all saw. So these are the captives that are returning. Well, it makes sense. Nehemiah was one of the first to go back. At least if you just take the story at face value. All right. We're going to go back to Nehemiah. We're going to go to chapter 2. Turn back. Someone read verse 6 of Nehemiah chapter 2. Jeff, you haven't got a chance. You want to read that? I knew you could handle it. What's the little detail there that makes you think maybe, possibly, of the story of Esther, right? And the queen sitting beside him. Could that be Esther sitting beside him? I mean, it would explain how favorable this king is, seemingly to Nehemiah, right? How much he blesses him and gives him vision in order to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. That would make sense if the queen is Esther. So, it obviously doesn't give her name there, so we're also on the skinny branches a little bit with that. But it would add some interesting color and nuance to the story and kind of explain the king's favorability, other than just obviously, kings are like rivers in the hands of God, right? God turns them as he wills. Anyway, so we've got Nehemiah. He's a governor, right? That's the title. We've got Ezra the scribe, Nehemiah the governor. And I was going to have to read another one. We'll skip that. So anyway, this I think harmonizes all the protagonists in these stories, but it does actually create a few difficulties. I mentioned the names of the various names given, I would say, of the same king, but this is an issue with this view. So I mentioned before, we've got Ahasuerus, Xerxes, Darius, but it wasn't too uncommon at this time to have throne names. So when you think of Caesar, you have to go, well, which Caesar, right? Is it Augustus, or who is the Caesar we're talking about? Pharaoh, right? Pharaoh's another throne name. We actually have some throne names in the Bible too. We've got Ben-Hadad, which is found in Jeremiah 49 and Amos 1. We also have Abimelech, which is in both Genesis 20:26 and Psalm 34. By the way, Abimelech is Ab, meaning father, Abraham, right? Father of them all too. And then Melech is king, so daddy's king. Right? It makes sense that would be a throne name. So anyway, it's possible that Artaxerxes and Darius referring to the same name, because this wasn't unprecedented in the ancient world. The various names of these kings. We've got Darius, which means doer / upholder of the good. There's Xerxes and Ahasuerus, which is the same man. That's not controversial. Means hero among kings, greatest among kings, chief of rulers. Artaxerxes means kingdom of justice. Anyway, actually, Whitney just finished The Idiot by Dostoevsky. I can never say that name right. Just slow down. Okay. Anyway, there's so many different characters in there. It's really hard to keep track of all these bizarre Russian names, multiple names used for characters, all these strange things. So again, this is just something that happens in history in certain places. And also, again, when I met her family, they all had nicknames for each other. It took a while to get used to all the various nicknames. Who's that? Whose name? Anyway, so not unprecedented. All right. So I think, in summary, more explanatory power is given to the text. There's fewer confusions, I think, in the text itself. Some other confusions, as we mentioned, but something else to think about during this time period. The books of Haggai and Zechariah are documented at the same time. That's not, I don't think, controversial. So anyway, when you read through those books, You guys are talking about the same events. They're talking about encouraging them to continue the building project and rebuking them when they stop. That was the big thing at that time. All right, how are we doing on time? We're doing good. All right, so I'll give you kind of an outline of the book of Nehemiah. No, this is assuming Ezra and Nehemiah are the same book. We've got Ezra chapter 1 through 6 is a historical review. And then Ezra's chapter 7 through 10 is Ezra's memoirs. And then starting in the beginning of Nehemiah through Nehemiah chapter 7 is Nehemiah's memoirs. And again, this is using the first person, right? We were talking about that. And then again, back to Ezra's memoirs in Nehemiah chapter 8 through 10. And then back to Nehemiah, again, part 2. That's through 11 through 13. So anyway, switching back and forth between first person, how we get to that. All right, so let's start looking through some of the various parts of Nehemiah. So we've got chapter 1 through 2, which is the return to Jerusalem to rebuild its walls. Does anyone know offhand, a little Bible trivia? What was Nehemiah's role before returning to Jerusalem? What was his job in Babylon? Yep, he's cupbearer of the king, right? The guy who would taste the king's wine, and he would die if someone trying to poison the king, he would get it. Yep. And do you remember what happened? What was the thing that makes the conversation happen between him and the king? Does anyone remember? He looked sad. Why was that? Why was that a problematic thing, right? I'll just say asking a question. In the presence of the king, right? You wanted everyone to be happy and in good spirits, and so it was probably threatening to perhaps both your job and your life if you were walking around sad in the king's presence. That doesn't look so good. Kings don't like that kind of vibe in their throne room. So he goes, he's got this very deferential sort of attitude when the king asks him, "Why are you sad?" Now, just before this, we've got him praying, right? He prays this amazing prayer, asking for God to rebuild the wall. Anyway, so then he gives him permission, right, the king, and he goes to Jerusalem to inspect the walls, and it's just total disarray, right? All these gates are burned, all the walls are destroyed. And then in chapter 2, we have the first signs of opposition to this project to rebuild the walls. And then in chapters 3 through 7, the walls are being built up, and there's all these difficulties, right? These guys causing them all this grief. And the people famously, right, they've got a trowel in one hand and a sword in the other as they're having to build the walls and being threatened by many people. And then we even see Nehemiah's contribution to the project in chapter 5. All right, so let's turn to chapter 8. Chapter 8, the beginning of the chapter here. And all the people gathered as one man into the square before the water gate. And they told Ezra the scribe to bring the book of the law of Moses that the Lord had commanded Israel. So Ezra the priest brought the law before the assembly, both men and women, all that could have understand what they heard. On the first day of the 7th month, and they read from it facing the square before the water gate, from early in the morning until midday, in the presence of men and women and all those who could understand. All the peoples were attentive to the book of the law. So anyway, we've got a great scene there, and actually I would say a justification for the way we do things here in having children in the service, right? As long as they have understanding, it makes sense for them to sit under the word of God being read. Yeah. Anyway, very encouraging scene. I alluded to this in my prayer, but we've got here where the people, it says that the word was translated. There's some question about what that, how to render that, whether the word was explained or they just didn't understand it. Because of course, Jews at this time were speaking more of a dialect of Hebrew, right? It was different than the biblical version. It was a more Aramaic kind of version of Hebrew. So whether the scribes actually translated it for the people or they were just explaining it is a little unclear. But the people then are joyful that they understood the word later in this chapter. So anyway, some great verses there. Later on in this chapter, this is the first time they keep the festival of booths. It's interesting because it says it's not since the days of Joshua had they kept it. It's an odd phrase. So we can look at that if we want. It's Dan furrowing his brow. I was struck by it too. Let's see. Starting verse 14. I'm scrolling down. I just want to see if they, where it said that. No, whatever. Oh, no, there it is. Yeah, verse 17. For from the days of Jeshua, the son of Nun, to that day, the people of Israel had not done so. Interesting. I don't know if that's idiomatic or if they just never kept the festival of booths, which is shocking because it sounds like the Bible tale festival feast, right? Because that was everyone got to go out and they all made tents, right, out of parts of trees, and then you dwelled in your tent and you ate lots of good food and you sat under Bible teaching for a week with your family. I mean, it was like this is the best one. Yeah. So anyway, it's a good reason for us to have Bible teaching, right? It's just following the Feast of Tabernacles. All right. Then we've got the next part of the book, which concerns the population. So it's just lots of names and lots of names and lots of things that they were doing. The priests and the Levites, right, counting them, and then that's from chapters 11 through 12, and then through the rest of chapter 12 to the end of the book, chapter 13. That's Nehemiah dealing with problems in the community, and this is of course the famous scene where Nehemiah rips the hair out of some people who had married foreign wives, right? He was really angered by this. So anyway, that's the rest of the book. And interestingly, Ezra and Nehemiah have sort of different leadership strategies. Because when Nehemiah is confronted by when Ezra is confronted by the same problem, he rips out his own hair, right? So these are different men, different kinds of temperaments and dispositions. But that leads me to a question I want us to discuss. So we've got Ezra pulling out his hair and beard in Ezra 9:3, and Nehemiah pulling out their hair in 13:25. Is that acceptable behavior? Is that sinful? Mm-hmm. Obviously, yeah, Ezra. I think it is. I mean, I think that there comes a point. I don't think we should move quickly to this kind of action, but sometimes I think we're warranted to do things that are a little more extreme. Just in case, with every. Go ahead, Jeff. Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's true. Yeah. And then of course we have Saint Nicholas, right? The original Saint Nicholas slapping what was it, Arius in the face. The for his the Arian, right? He believed that Jesus wasn't God. So men of old were a little bit more. We're soft. That's maybe what we can see there. So this does lead to an interesting question about the divorces that go on here, right? How, was it wrong for them to divorce these wives, right? We've got in the New Testament, you take all the information in the New Testament, it seems like there's two grounds for divorce. One is Jesus' exception given in Matthew 19, where he talks about except for fornication, right? So that is, porneas is a potential reason for divorce, or two grounds for divorce. And then the other one is given in 1 Corinthians 7, when Paul talks about abandonment, right? She's not fit to dwell with you as a spouse. She leaves. You are not bound. So these seem to be the two grounds. And then obviously we have the words in Malachi, which is a disputed verse. It says that God hates divorce. So how are we to take this instance of God saying you need to, or Ezra and Nehemiah saying you need to divorce this? I think there are two reasonable possibilities from the text. One is the, uh, there's different standards for priests. So if you look at the laws, like they were only even married a virgin within their tribe. Those are the rules. Um, so it's possible, they're married to pagan women. That's really outside of what's acceptable for priests. They were held to a different standard than the average Israelite. So that's a possibility. The other possibility is that the practices were so heinous of these pagan women, right? It wasn't like being married to a good Buddhist woman or something, getting saved. It was like they might have been involved in, the form of worship that was done in this time was pretty despicable. So just imagining having her be involved in that would be hard to, it would basically be on the level of fornication as far as grounds for divorce. So, but still, it's a hard one for us to read sometimes when we think about some of the exceptions to divorce. But I think that obviously it was justified. And there may be, anyway. Any thoughts on that? Yeah. Yeah, yeah, that's a really good point. Any other party words? All right. Well, I'll pray, and it's all good. Thank you, Father, for your word. Grant that it would be food for us and sustain us. Bless us now as we prepare to worship you. Grant us soft hearts, tender consciences. Grant us the word. Build us up.